All right. Hello again, everyone. Welcome to another one of my webinar interviews. Today, we're very, very fortunate. The topic today is going to be seminary formation, which maybe sounds a little dull to some viewers, but it's actually a topic that is so important in the church today. How our future priests are going to be formed, and we're very fortunate to have with us today Deacon Dr. James Keating. He is a professor at Kendrick Glennon Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri, professor of moral theology. No, not moral theology. Spiritual theology. And he's also involved in spiritual direction and formation there at Kendrick Glennon Seminary. And so and I've known Deacon Jim for a long time. Now, for the first time I've met Msgr. Michael Heintz. He is the academic dean at Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland, my alma mater, of which I am proud of. I'm a Mountie. I love the Mount. And he is also professor of historical and systematic theology at the Mount. And of course, obviously a spiritual and formator at the seminary. So welcome, gentlemen. We're just going to start with a brief prayer.
Thank you.
The Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Mary, seat of wisdom,
pray for us.
All right, gentlemen, let's get right to it because Monsignor has to leave here very quickly in about 40 minutes or so. So we don't want to waste time with a lot of chit-chat and small talk beforehand. So I'm going to start then with Monsignor. Because he does have to go in 40 minutes, and we'll go down to Deacon Jim. Deacon James, how do you prefer Deacon Keating? What honor should I call you? Your Majesty? Would that be better?
Please do. Yes.
Okay, Your Majesty.
That's what my wife calls me. So I'm sure your wife does too.
Oh, Carrie calls me many things. And hopefully she'll be here later. But anyway, as I said, not a lot of chit-chat, but chit-chat's fun. Monsignor Heintz, what do you are now boots on the ground, academic dean at Mount St. Mary's. Back in the day when I was at the Mount, which was like 81 through 86, it was known for being a very orthodox seminary, without necessarily being very, very conservative or stuffy seminary, but it's just orthodox theologically. Guys like Germain Grisey taught there. For example, and I studied under Grisey. So briefly tell us, what do you think is the tone and tenor of the average seminarian today? What is their average? Is there an average background? Are they all over the map? What are guys at the Mount like today? And therefore, what spiritual formation needs do you think that they have most?
Yeah, I think there isn't a monochromic seminarian model that you could say like, oh, clearly he cuts that mold. We have men coming from backgrounds as various as undergrad at, say, Ave Maria or Christendom. We have men coming from Purdue with a background in engineering. We have a couple of lawyers. We've had a dentist. We've had a number of men coming from different backgrounds and ages. The average age is probably around 28, 27 or 28. So we have guys as young as 21, 22, and some guys in their 40s and 50s. We have a man who is a former nuclear engineer on a submarine. So it's a broad array of backgrounds, but they all come, and I would say I think they come with a deep desire. They love the Lord, they love the church, traditional and bent, but not rigid. And rigidity is something that we watch for because it's not helpful in pastoral life. But they often come, they've come from a whole broad range of backgrounds. I think spiritually the greatest need is the appreciation of silence and the appreciation of like unplugging from the digital sphere.
That's big.
Yeah, I find I'm not very techie. I don't have any social media, but even I spend too much time looking at my phone, whether it's news or whatever. And I think that I'm in the minority here in terms of the amount of time spent on electronics. But I do find that it's shaped the way their minds work. That is, I teach among other things Greek and Latin, and just the simple capacity to memorize has been lessened in the last 25 years because, when I was a child of 12 years old, I probably had to remember 25 phone numbers off the top of my head.
Exactly.
These young men don't have to remember anything. And so just getting them to learn vocabulary or paradigms, it's harder for them than it was for my generation because the way their brains have been formed. And so I think that really helping them to detox from technology, not that technology is an evil in itself, but that learning to living in communion with the Lord, in a deep friendship with the Lord and an ongoing conversation with the Lord without relying upon or thinking that it's tech driven. Too often relationships, I saw this, I was at Notre Dame for a number of years, and undergrads on campus would live in the same room, in the same dorm, and their only communication would be by text message to one another. They wouldn't actually, they'd be sleeping in the same room, but they wouldn't speak to one. I mean, not because they were trying to avoid speaking. Texting has become a replication for conversation. And in fact, it's even replaced email now. You'll find, I don't know, Deacon Jim, this is your experience at Kenrick Glennon. The men don't check their email regularly. They expect things to be texted to them as opposed to. So we have a basic principle. You need to be checking your email multiple times a day because you will in a parish need to do that. And, texting may be your preferred mode of communication, but that's not the way everyone else works. So teaching them that the communication, conversation, texting is not the same thing as conversation, and the conversation itself isn't even the same thing as communion. That prayer is more than just talking to God or simply listening to the Lord, and helping them learn how to pray. I think that's the biggest challenge. We have a number of men, a number of dioceses that are our partners, send men regularly to IPF. It's a game changer for so many of them in terms of their understanding of what prayer is and how to pray. They come here with great earnestness, but very little formation in the spiritual life. And so there's occasionally some who come from, say, a college seminary where they've had that formation, but the majority of men are coming not from that background, and they don't have a whole lot of formation in the life of prayer. That's a long answer to a simple question.
But that's a really interesting answer. It's not an answer that I was actually expecting. And you've sort of identified sort of being completely formed and immersed in the world of smart gadgets and tech as one of the chief obstacles to their spiritual formation. And of course, I'm sitting here going, well, duh, of course that. I was thinking that there'd be a whole range of other issues, hyper-traditionalist, or I was thinking all ideologically, but here it's...
Well, I mean, that's a challenge we face as well, but to me, that's less of a challenge than, because there may be individuals for whom that's an issue, but as a whole, it's the tech issue, which I think is something for example, it's now possible, and it's a great convenience in some circumstances, to be able to pray on your phone. I strongly discourage the men from praying on their phone on any regular basis for several reasons. First of all, when they pick up their phone, they're used to doing one of 5 or 6 different activities: texting, checking news, websites, blogs, any number of other things. So when they pick it up, their body is used to doing, and their mind is used to doing something very different from prayer.
Absolutely.
When you pick up a breviary, the only thing you don't text with a breviary, you don't check news with a breviary, you don't update your status on a breviary, so to speak. But what you do is you pray, and the muscle memory of picking up that book, which is used only for prayer.
Yeah, but it's like that dinosaur technology of ribbons and what stuff.
Well, I'm old school, so, but I think there's a value. So I think trying to get them to, I've used my phone for prayer in a pinch, but it should never be the normative mode of engaging the hours, for example.
Yeah, Carrie and I, my wife, Carrie, for those who don't know, we're Benedictine Oblates, and we pray the Liturgy of the Hours. And in a pinch, I sometimes have picked up my iPad and said, okay, but I notice that while I'm praying, if a text message comes up or something like that, I'll actually stop. Say, well, I'll come back to that psalm in a minute, or I'll do the canticle when I'm done text. And it's just, that's just no good. Well, Deacon Jim, what are your thoughts on, do you have a similar experience with regard to your seminarians with regard to the tech issues?
I'm just thinking of Michael's comments about email, and to me, we're learning that email is like the VHS of the 21st century. I mean, these guys, they don't know what email is. And pretty soon, as when Michael and I go out into the pasture land, I bet you they won't even have email in seminaries. They'll probably just have text messages, because their generation, the next rector generation, for example, I mean, I can't imagine there's going to be a life for email. I think generationally also, I would characterize the men in our seminary as ironically orthodox. And by that, I mean, it's almost in the background. where in past decades, orthodoxy was something you fought for, was something that you had to contrast with dissenters in the church, so to speak.
Yeah.
And today it's just what we teach, and it's what they contemplate, and it's what they question, what they bring up questions about the meaning of it or the pastoral relevance of it. But there's almost an amazing peacefulness about it in the house, and it's a beautiful thing, because to be around as long as we've been around, we know that it wasn't always a peaceful thing to try and teach the doctrine. On the other hand, like Michael said, with individuals, and Michael knows about this more than I do perhaps, but there could be in this generation a trend of rival formators. So because of the very thing that Michael was talking about, the technology, they do tend to either follow on YouTube or blogs or podcasts other clerical leaders besides the ones sitting in front of them in their seminaries.
Yeah.
And sometimes they tend to keep this secret too. So I'm not sure whether it's trending toward the political right or the political left, but these podcasts or these other technological conversations could be kind of hiding in the background of their interior dialogue that maybe they don't bring up as much in class. So, somebody could be following Taylor Marshall, somebody could be following James Martin. We don't really know necessarily unless it's going to spill out into a conversation. But we know that rival formation level, which some people might just call good dialogue. I know every time you talk about orthodoxy, people think you're in some kind of microcosm think tank where you're not letting other ideas in. But not so, but people panic about that. But I don't think that's a way to let other ideas in if it's more secretive or just more popular or partisan, like those podcasts and blogs tend to be.
That's very interesting, because that goes into a question. I talk to a lot of people in different seminaries, because having started this blog and it's gone a bit viral, I get all these emails, a lot of them from people in various seminaries. And I often get emails that say, "Thank you for starting this blog. That's Communio Theology Ressourcement Defending Vatican II," because so many of our seminarians are very smitten by the radical traditionalists, the loud, what I call the fiddleback fuss budgets on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And Taylor Marshall is a convenient target, but there are many others. So is that Monsignor? Also, do you see any of that at the Mount, or influence of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would describe our men. I like the idea of ironically orthodox. I think ours, I would describe them as cautiously orthodox. That is to say, young men come here totally with the church, and there's a cautiousness about anything outside the realm of what the church teaches, and it comes from, I think, a generational fear of failure. They don't want to get something wrong, which is also what drives the fear or unwillingness to commit that we see in younger people. There's a fear of commitment, and part of it is they don't want to commit to something that they might mess up or get wrong. And I think so it's not driven by an ideology by and large. It's just a cautiousness about not wanting to fail.
Yeah.
And I do think there are individuals you have to watch. I ask my formation advisees and directees when we meet initially, where do you get your news? What do you listen to? Who do you read? Yeah. I want to know who's feeding them. And I think that's really important. Now, they may or may not be, hopefully they're being honest, but they could be disingenuous. But, every now and again, you'll get a guy who's clearly not on the same page as the rest of us. And where's this coming from? Sometimes it's a parallel formator back home in their diocese who's a big influence on them. It could be some blog they're reading or website that they found. It's not a major issue, but it's something you have to be attentive to. And I think asking up front, like, hey, where do you get your news? What feeds you intellectually and spiritually? Who are you reading? If one great question to ask them is, what's the biggest issue facing the church in the 21st century? And that often opens up where they're coming from and what their concerns are.
That's very interesting. If you'd have asked me that question when I was a seminary, I went to minor seminary too. 1978 was my first year. St. Pius X Seminary, Erlanger, Kentucky. It no longer exists. It was very, very conservative seminary. But anyway, if you'd asked me that question, what is the sort of what does the church need? I would have said then, to avoid heresy. I was a wanderer reading, sort of heresy hunting little guy, because I wanted to stay safe too. It's a very interesting you put it that way. I grew up in the silly season after Vatican II, and I was reacting against that. Deacon Jim mentioned, right? You talked about how, they're kind of looking for something there, and it's an heretic orthodoxy, because they know that the waters outside are kind of troubled, but they're not certain about the waters inside either. I was utterly convinced the waters outside are just awful, and so we have to. But I wouldn't answer that question the same way now. That the biggest problem the church faces is heresy is a problem, obviously, but I wouldn't identify that as the chief problem. But anyway, Deacon Jim, do you have any comments on any or all of that?
Well, I think we still, unfortunately, have this divided church. There is, ideologically and doctrinally, and but in the diocesan seminaries, sometimes I call it a miracle after Pastores Dabo Vobis, and then some of the programs for priestly formation that were developed, and then the seminary visitations late in the last decade or so. I mean, that Irenic orthodoxy took up residence in these diocesan seminaries in ways that are almost miraculous, because in the last 14 years or so that I've been traveling around to different seminaries, I don't know of a diocesan seminary where you could say, well, you've got a bunch of dissenters in this one. There still is, and even the report on the seminaries that came out many years ago now, but there still is a tendency in religious orders perhaps to experiment on the fringes. But the diocesan seminaries are just kind of ripe for a deeper contemplation of the doctrine and dogma at depths that perhaps we could never take people to before, because they were so enamored of novelty. And now, since there is this sort of expected peacefulness around the teaching of theology, we have theologians and we have students who are capable and eager to go to such depths that I can't remember, let's say in the early 90s when I began teaching, that they wanted these depths. We all know that dogma, liturgy, sacramentals, theology, scripture is almost inexhaustible in terms of what the depths we can go. And there isn't much like looking over to the right or to the left or behind them and saying, well, yeah, this is Catholic stuff, but what else is out there? And I'm kind of marvel at the fact that we can take this generation so deep.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Because back in my day, young whippersnappers, I found most of my fellow seminarians to be intellectually incurious. That they were sort of brick and mortar guys, very pious, but nevertheless not very intellectually curious at all. There were a few of us who were, and we sort of banded together. So that's actually very heartening to hear. Do you find the same thing, Monsignor, at the Mount?
Yeah, it's interesting because exactly the role. One of the things we do, we're not doing it intentionally necessarily, is to sort of model the breadth of the Catholica. There are people who swim a little more on the right side of the baptismal font, a little more on the left side of the baptismal font, but we're all in the same font. And nobody's on the outside. And I'm no Thomist. I'm the first to say I am no Thomist. And I have Thomist colleagues. We might differ on some things, but all within the bounds of Catholicism. And to model that there is within Catholicism a richness that is irreducible to sort of a monochromic orthodoxy.
Well, that's all music to I did my dissertation on Hans Urs von Balthasar, and his whole notion is that theology is this symphony of voices, and so I can't tell you how heartening this is to hear this. Because
we don't do it intentionally, but it's just interesting. Like, they'll hear different perspectives from different professors in classes, and they'll bring them up. It's like, Father so and so, Professor so and so said this, and it's not like he's wrong or she's right. It's, well, here's a different perspective and why, and there's no dissonance in their mind. I don't think that, oh my gosh, this is terrible.
So there's a real intellectual conversation going on.
I hope that's what we want.
Well, then let me ask both of you then this question, and then there's tons more that are now firing off in my head. How paradigmatic are your two seminaries for the broader seminary world in the United States? In other words, is your experience, can we take this as rather normative for what's going on in a lot of other places?
Well, I mean, I know of no great division in the diocesan seminary world theologically, where, even early again in the past century, in the 90s or so, there was sort of an agitation, let's say, between some Thomists and then other schools of thought. But right across the hallway from me is Larry Feingold, probably one of the greatest Thomists on the earth right now. And I can mention the name von Balthasar, and he doesn't break out in a sweat. He actually, has a conversation with me about, some essay in Communio or something like that. And it's a beautiful, wonderful, life-giving conversation. And like Michael said, too, you can quote Thomas and you can quote Ignatius of Loyola and you can quote von Balthasar in your class. And they just keep taking notes and asking questions. And that's a beautiful image that Michael used, I think, the big baptismal font. There's a lot of people swimming around in there. And this generation of seminarians seems to think that, they all belong swimming in that pool. And
that's what we want. We want them to be formed that way. Exactly.
Yeah. And for them to be to sort of this expansive understanding that theology that is orthodox is also creative and interesting.
When I teach, one of the things I try to make very clear is that orthodoxy is about parameters rather than a fixed center point. And I always say to them, to use the language of more or less orthodox is to use the language more or less pregnant. You either are or you aren't. And to call someone else less orthodox is to suggest that and you find and you occupy that center fixed point around which it all revolves. The church has never done that. The church establishes parameters within which orthodoxy is found. So you're either within that or you're not. And the categories of more or less in that, I think, are very unhelpful.
Well, I think you just actually answered, by way of anticipation, the next question that I wanted to ask a little ways further down, but I'll ask it now. You used earlier the word, we don't want our seminarians to have rigidity. We didn't want, and that was a huge word when I was in seminary formation, late 70s into the 80s. And back then, it was a term, I think, that was largely code for you're conservative and we don't like that. Yeah. And so seminarians often greatly resented being called rigid because it simply meant you were orthodox.
Yes.
All right. And so now you hear Pope Francis uses that word now. And even though I know he doesn't mean that, it still cuts at me because I thought this is a word that was a cut word back in the day and used unfairly. You're obviously not using it in an unfair way, but I think you just defined what you mean by it.
Yeah, I think, when I was a seminary from 1985 to 1993, and I had much the same experience as you, Larry, that those who were described as rigid, it often was just code for you're with the church.
Yeah.
You
support Mane Vitae, therefore you're rigid.
You're rigid, exactly. Today, I would not use it that way. All our men in the seminary, there's no young man here who's not with the church. What I mean by rigid is less about, first of all, it's ideology rather than theology. Okay. Yeah. It's not theologizing, it's ideologizing, however you turn that into a verb and then a noun. It's ideological, and it also has to do with the manner of your presentation of self and the faith to others, rather than an intellectual position in itself. So again, I have colleagues who may be a little more conservative or a little more progressive. I even hate those terms, but we're all part of the church. We have different perspectives on things, all within the bounds of orthodoxy. Certainly, there's no doubt in my mind. And the same thing is true of the seminarians. But the rigid guy is the guy who wants to use the faith as a cudgel. Yeah. To prove, the point of a theological argument is not a desire to seek the truth. It's the desire to prove that you're right and the other is wrong. Yeah. And that's not the tradition. To win the debate. Yes. Deacon Jim, that's the libido dominandi. That's what that is. That is Augustine's libido dominandi in the mode of intellectual discourse. And when a young priest
like that gets into a parish, they can do a lot of damage because they can be a real wrecking ball, just coming in with a full head of steam and doing some damage. But Deacon Jim, on that same topic of, rigidity and
I think mostly rigidity is like an emotional pathology. It even more so than some kind of doctrinal question.
Amen.
There's something in the man that is unhealed or broken or wounded, and it coalesces around fear or coalesces around anxiety or stress. And so when Francis or other people today, talk about rigidity, I think in my experience of the seminary, maybe Michael's too, the rigid seminarian today is not the orthodox one. The rigid seminarian is the one who probably needs some therapy. And if he gets that therapy, he'll probably be a good thinker.
Yeah.
But his emotional pain is blocking him from thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And also rigidity too, I think, is, like Michael was saying, ideological. There is still in our culture that, I'm on the left, I'm on the right, and that can box people in. But again, I think that's more in the secular culture that I see today than in the walls of a seminary. There, and even around the liturgy, which, in the 80s and 90s was kind of the classic symbol for a rigid guy. You looked at him to see how rigid he was and what he wore and all that.
Oh, yeah.
People can answer about, his seminary, but the guys around liturgy today are just so free and relaxed. They follow the liturgist here on campus, but there's no big division. There's no a lot of chatter about who's doing it right and who's doing it wrong. Again, there's just a lot of peacefulness, which is so liberating to be in a house like that when we know the history that liturgy was so divisive many years ago.
Sure was.
The devil is the divider. And look, at the world's divided, the culture's divided, the church is divided, the nation's divided. He wins. Seminaries can be divided. And we need to resist that within our communities because it's demonic to play into that polarization. Mm-hmm. And I think we can all be tempted at times to pick sides. It's just not helpful. I think you're exactly right, Deacon Jim. I think that the rigidity is actually a function of, it's a human, as Larry, Jim and I have talked about this many times. In seminaries, you really don't have intellectual, pastoral, or spiritual problems in seminarians. You have human problems that manifest themselves spiritually, intellectually, or pastorally. And this rigidity is a human issue, not an intellectual one or a spiritual one. It's the incapacity to function with ambiguity. And
yes,
that ambiguity terrifies. And so looking for clarity, a level of clarity which is real and true and often possible only after we're dead. The beatific visions will have a level of clarity. And so gray makes them nervous because they hear gray and they think it's a denial of objective truth. It's not a denial of objective truth. It's denial of the capacity in this moment to have an exact, clear view of it.
I think that is really gets to the nub of things. I mean, you're always anticipating the next question I'm going to ask. I think we've got a whole Kreskin thing going here because I was going to quote the late, great Lorenzo Albacete, who was once asked, he taught at Dunwoody up in New York. And he was once asked, what is the number one need in terms of seminary formation, intellectual, pastoral? He goes, it is to make them human and to make sure that they're human. And he says, if they're first human beings in a full, robust sense of that word, mature, psychologically well put together, then the other dominoes can fall from that. And so that brings me then to the elephant in the living room that I think a lot of the viewers would want you guys to chime in on, which is the sexuality question. I mean, obviously, priestly sex abuse is much in the news for whatever reason, whether it's a lot of overhype or whether it's, not overhyped and a serious issue still. What do you think needs to be done? And we'll go to Monsignor first and then down to Deacon Jim. First, I'm going to back up a second. What do you think is the level of psychosexual maturity of the average seminarian coming in? And let's just say with the average young seminarian coming in.
I'm not probably competent as a psychologist or psychiatrist to make that judgment. we rely very heavily upon the screening that is done by dioceses as they send men, so that men who come here, one of the things that is required for admission, of course, is a full psych workup. And that's done through their diocese. And what I've seen happen in my experience from the time I was a seminarian to today is that the screening and vetting we're doing is much, much better. Here's the problem. Someone who's deeply pathological can beat the system.
They're experts at hiding things.
Exactly. And we can do all the work. We do the best we can. And if someone really wants to try to submarine, as it were, or bury a deep-seated problem, unless it's manifest and it's seen, we're helpless to. I mean, sin has always existed, and this brokenness which isn't to downplay it. I think we're doing a much better job formationally than we did. These men are much more free. I am moved by their transparency and vulnerability in talking about their struggles, for example, in the areas of chastity. It's so deeply moving to me. My generation was far less open and vulnerable with formation staff about these things. And I find it noble and honest and moving. And so seminaries exist to form men. They don't exist to fix men. And I think that if something at an earlier level of screening isn't done, and a diocese tries to present someone for seminary formation who might be a candidate in other circumstances, but he has serious enough issues to work on that all our energy here will be spent not on forming him, but on fixing him, he doesn't belong here yet. And perhaps not at all. That's got to be dealt with first. So the human stuff has to be at least basically in place. I find most of the men here come in here with a degree of transparency, not surprising the typical struggles of a man in his 20s in our culture. Chastity is much more difficult today with the immediate accessibility of pornography, for example, in your pocket on your phone.
Yeah.
And, and these kids, some of these men were exposed to this very early on, others later. It's a real challenge. And you see this across the board in university campuses, high schools. It's a big problem.
Oh, it's everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think that because since Pastor's Dabo Vobis and the greater attention given to human formation, the psychological dimension of that human element has been given much greater scrutiny, and that's helpful. That said, no system is foolproof. No psychological assessment is going to be infallible. And if someone is going to really bury and sink and dive and to avoid detection, so to speak, there's not a whole lot that can be done other than try to discover it in the course of some other mode.
That's interesting. And it's very encouraging to hear that there's a lot stronger pre-screening going on, because I don't think the screening was great when I was, and here comes my wife. Great. I don't think the screening was great when I first went to seminary in 1978, and I think that made, and then it put the ball in the court of the seminaries themselves, which puts the seminary in a bind. Seminaries don't want to just start kicking guys out willy-nilly, because then they anger the bishops that are sending the guys there, right? And you end up losing clientele. And I mean, you gotta have warm bodies in the seats, and that was a bad dynamic. So it is very good that it's more upfront now from the dioceses themselves, doing a much stronger, because they don't want to go bankrupt in the future.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, even I hope their motives are more than that, but yeah.
Well, you get my point. They
now
recognize we have a problem.
Yes.
Therefore, we cannot just simply put warm bodies. We're not going to lay our hands to send anybody that's willing to sign up on the dotted line. And I think there was an element of that back 30 years ago.
Sure. But we've even seen instances in the last 3 or 4 years of younger priests with deep pathologies that weren't discovered in seminary, and that's my point. And these men would have had the screening that would be given to anyone.
They're very good at hiding things. But anyway, we're going to get to Deacon Jim's answer to this same question in a minute. But I'd like to, for the first time in the Gaudium et Spes 22 webinar series, we have the appearance of my beautiful wife, Carrie Magnuson Chapp, Dr. Chapp. She has a PhD in sacramental theology from Duquesne University, same as Deacon Jim down below. These two, you and Deacon Jim, know each other. So say hi, Carrie.
Hi, it's good to like both of you.
Hi, Carrie. Yeah, Duquesne was much better because I got to sit next to Carrie in class. I'll tell you that. So it's good seeing you, and I can imagine you just came from feeding the sheep or something like that.
No, actually, she's the director of our homeschooling co-op at the Ordinariate parish that we attend, and that's just down the street from us here. Because we're actually in our house in Scranton. We have a second house in Scranton, 1 block from our Ordinariate parish.
Oh, okay.
But we're cradle Catholics, but don't tell anybody. We go to Ordinariate. I just told the whole world. It's a beautiful community. She runs the cooperative there. But I would also, the reason why I really encouraged her when she was done with work to join us, she spent 8 years working at St. Charles Seminary, in Philadelphia. So she is also very conversant in seminary formation issues. So I thought we'd bring her on board. But anyway, Deacon Jim, that same question about the human element, screening, psychosexual maturity, immaturity, pornography, just sort of riff on that, if you don't mind.
Well, I think, along with Michael, if bishops who have every right to have input into a seminary, vocation directors, the same, if they would trust more the judgment of the formation team who live with the man every day,
right?
I think that would really help the Catholic Church a lot, because there is this human experience of, like you said, not wanting to upset church authority or lose a diocese from a seminary. But in my, 30-something years of being involved in priestly formation, the people on the ground really have a great grasp of who this man is. And they need to be trusted when they make a recommendation that he should leave, or that he should take a year off, or that he needs therapy. But again, like Michael said, we're not here to fix them. We have to discern whether or not they can respond. Every seminary has a psychologist today too, I'm pretty sure. But they're there just to assist in formation. They're not there to do really deep therapy. And men who need that probably have to leave campus. And whether it's a recommendation for them to leave therapy or just a recommendation for the men that he doesn't have a vocation, the outside clerics, bishops, vocation directors, hopefully they'll just trust their seminary formation team to make some of those judgments. The one thing that formation has really done today, which is, I think, very positive, is that more and more men discern. They just are so happy when they leave. They really don't. There's no more Catholic ghetto kind of cultural pressure on them, where you almost felt like you committed a sin when you discerned out. Today, because of all of the integration of the formation that we have, the beauty of seeing a man pack his bags and leave today is something really to tell the church. And it's to tell them this: the seminary works. It's a successful set of relationships that either encourages a man to keep going, or shows the man the beauty of his vocation lies elsewhere. And of course, he comes to agree with that completely. Secondly, I would just say this. There is a new openness, like Michael was saying, about celibacy and about men sharing about their desire for celibacy, their struggles with chastity. But I still think we have to emphasize more to the men the nitty-gritty of the celibate life, and also the supernatural origin of the celibate life, because sometimes in their imagination, I notice when they speak that celibacy is still a sidecar to priesthood. And there could be this sense of, well, I really want to be a priest. And and that celibacy thing, that comes with it, and I'm fine with it. And sometimes I think we have to do it backwards to really ask them the question, is the Trinity inviting you to be sustained in love by the beauty of the Trinity itself until you die? Do you sense that is your call? In other words, your call to radical celibacy, to trust that God is sufficient for you. Let's talk about that first. And we not have celibacy as like down south, you get grits whether you ask for them or not. They just come. And celibacy should not come like grits do down south. It should be a more up and front supernatural discernment. That's the other thing that I think we have to dispense with, is any language about celibacy being practical, where bishops might say, well, yeah, we'll have to be celibate because, it's easier to move you guys around.
Yeah.
That is a horrible detriment to a man's erotic life, to reduce his gift of the body to just being a chess piece to make the ecclesial assignments easier. And so any conversation about celibacy being pragmatic should be just verboten in the seminary.
Yeah.
It's a supernatural gift, and you're either being offered it and you're responding, or it's not and you're not.
Well, then I'm going to ask then, because Monsignor has to go. And so, I wrote a whole blog thing on celibacy, and I'm full disclosure, very open to the concept of married clergy. I'm very open to the concept of mandatory celibacy. I have no hard and fast position on that issue. But I would ask Monsignor the question, is there a direct linkage between not a direct linkage on a metaphysical level, but is there a strong linkage between priesthood as such and an actual call from God to the celibate life? Or can I be called to the priesthood and still just treat celibacy, as Deacon Jim called it, like just a sidecar, something a hoop I have to jump through?
Well, if that's the way you feel, you belong in the Eastern Rite, not in the Roman Church, not in the Western Church. And
right.
So a man who discerns priesthood but not celibacy isn't called to priesthood in the Roman Rite. And so there is, in the Western tradition, there's a direct link. There are exceptions, obviously. But God doesn't play games with people. If he's genuinely calling a man to priesthood in the Roman Rite, he's also calling him to celibacy, and he's going to give him that charism. And part of it is, I think Jim's spot on. We have to stop making this about practicalities. Like, well, it just works better and we save money. It's a charism. It's a supernatural gift, and it's one that's received. I point out to the men all the time, like, look, the life we live is unnatural. But it's not simply unnatural. It becomes supernatural if it's a charism. Because we're made for communion, and men are made for communion with a woman. A man and a woman are made for one another. And to live without that, to deny that, is at one level unnatural, but by grace it becomes supernatural. It can only be accomplished by grace, not just white knuckling and not just kind of a semi-Pelagian, I'm really good at this. Yeah. I've mastered myself. That doesn't win. There's no merit there, because we can't earn our own. We don't earn merit, in that way.
I are on the same. It's amazing. You keep presciently anticipating. I was just going to say, so you can't white knuckle your way through the priesthood, and you just stole my word. That's great.
You could, and some men have, but at the end of the day, it's not just can you live this life. It's can you live this life fruitfully and joyfully.
Amen.
And there are men who may have made a mistake, who maybe they really weren't called to this, and they're ordained and they're celibate. Their salvation and their witness is going to be in their fidelity to what they promised, rather than I did a really good job. It's the fidelity to promises. And I think that's the issue. There are lots of unhappy, grumpy priests, who wants that guy in your parish? We don't need Father Mean. We don't need Father Weird. And we need to produce men who can be eminently assignable. That is, they can go in any number of types of contexts. We don't need niche boutique priests who can only do this kind of work or this kind of parish. What bishops want is assignability, because that's what the church needs.
Or father drunk, or father never there.
Yeah, father absent landlord, father bachelor.
Father
9 to 5, I'm off the clock at 5.
Father always in Rome on a charter flight. Yeah. Anyway, I know you have to go, Monsignor. Yeah. I can't think. Maybe we do a follow-up someday soon.
I would love this. You're delightful, so thank you.
In the meantime, give our absolute love to our old friend, Monsignor Andy Baker, who is your rector.
My boss. And he's a great rector, and he's done a good job, a very good job here. And it's a happy house, and it's a holy house, I think. And we're doing well. And as Jim said, it's really an honor and privilege to serve in a seminary. I didn't get ordained to serve in a seminary. I wanted to be a parish priest. And I believe I have to take this call because I think that's why I need to leave. So God bless.
God bless you.
Thank you.
Bye, Father. and then there were 3. So I don't want to, like a complete chauvinist here, ignore my well-credentialed wife. Do you want to ask a question to Deacon Jim here?
I'm kind of jumping in the.
That's
jumping in
okay.
the last minute here.
We're good at jumping into things
First,
here.
it's great to see you, Jim. It's
You too. Thank you.
always great to see you. So yeah, it's been over 20 years, almost 20 years since I've really been in seminary. 15 years anyway.
Has it been that long now?
So,
Well,
yeah.
but I will ask. Okay, I'm going to ask you a question, and then I'll turn it over to him. I think one of the things I've noticed about my wife is that she has remained somewhat close to many of the seminarians that she knew at St. Charles, who are now priests, who she taught, classes to, who are now they email her and they come visit the farm and so on. And I remember in my days at the Mount, there were a couple of female professors in the seminary. How important do you think in overall seminary formation is it for there to be a female presence on the faculty among the formators at the seminary?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say it's absolutely essential. And then, of course, going way back in our history, we know that there have been hundreds of years without females on the faculty. But, and I guess, people muddled through. But from my experience of being on faculty with women, I want to say that's essential for this reason. And I'm going to say a particular kind of woman. And that particular kind of woman is a woman who is there because she has fallen in love with the Mass. She doesn't love priests, and she doesn't love priesthood, and she doesn't love the idea of being on the faculty as a woman. She actually loves the Mass so deeply that almost perhaps unconsciously, she has sought out an openness to be on a seminary faculty because she knows that without priests, her first love is impossible to exist. And so with the women who are really successful, if you will, on seminary faculty, they carry this deep, deep sacramental imagination and love for the church without being any type of sycophant or any type of emotionally attached to the idea of priests. And they're also the best formators and psychologists in seminary world for the very same reason. They have no stake in wanting priests to like them because they love the Mass too much.
That's an excellent point, Jim. And I'm going to concur with you that, yeah, you love these men who you are forming or teaching. I did more intellectual formation than anything because you want them to love the Mass. You want them to love what they're doing and to know this is the most important thing that happens on the planet. And that's what you're called to do. And if you're not willing to die for that, get the heck out. We don't need you to be the bachelor priest or what all these priests you guys just mentioned. We need priests who love giving their lives to Christ and being Christ in the world. And you mentioned before how you're having them discern, is the Trinity welcoming you into itself is kind of what you're saying. Are you in regard to celibacy, are you going to be Christ on the cross for the world? And that's all, anything else just flows out of that. If everything, and I don't want to say everything else is superfluous, it's actually just the opposite. Everything else in your life is going to be attached to that. And if it's not, then it's superfluous. Mm-hmm. So for like being on a seminary faculty, that was the privilege part of it. Like I felt privileged to be in a classroom teaching the men about all these I taught ecclesiology, I taught sacramental theology. So I do love the liturgy. This is my field. Like I love the liturgy, I love the Mass. And I still I do meet up with priests who I taught and they remind me of things I said that I don't even know that I said, and it all goes back to the Mass. You're absolutely right. Like your love for the bride of Christ and for her celebration of her liturgy. So I think that's really important. And I know from my experience back then, being a woman in the seminary, the formation team was very interested in what we had to say about the men, how they treated us both in the classroom and outside the classroom, and were they chauvinistic or did they not respect us, or that. So I was very happy about that, to know that my opinion, or if I saw a problem, or if this one's a little flirtatious, or this one, whatever I was able to say and contribute, I would catch things that the male formators wouldn't catch, because a woman is in a different relationship with her students than especially the formators who are on the formation team, that they're just trying to impress. Like, I want to do everything right in front of so and so, but I wasn't on the formation team, but they still asked my opinion about things, and I thought that was really important, that they saw has a different perspective on
because they let their guard down.
Yeah.
For those who are trying to play the game, they let their guard down. Obviously, for the man of integrity, he's the same, no matter whether he's with a formator or just a professor, so to speak. But yeah, well, the input of everyone around, and as you know, Carrie, even like the input of the maintenance staff is so important, because if there is a guy playing the game, then he's certainly not going to treat the maintenance staff the same way as he's treating other people.
Right.
So the whole collection of those human beings who are in relationship in what we call a seminary should have some input. And I think in the new Ratio, Francis and company point this out when they say seminaries should be more open. Not an enclosed community, but have families come in and have people from parishes come in. I know in our own seminary here in St. Louis, regularly they have young adults come in. They have a young adult evening for them, sponsored by the seminarians. They hear a talk, and then they have a social. And so, dozens and dozens of young adults come on campus, and they interact with the seminarians. And so the more the seminary is open, the more feedback the church is going to get, whether or not these men have personalities that will be obstacles to Christ or bridges to Christ.
That brings me, we have about, we still have a little bit of time. Do you have time? I hope you still have time.
I have 5 minutes, till 4 o'clock.
Okay. Well, that's good. My last question then is, one of the things I really enjoyed about being at Mount St. Mary's, for those who don't know, Mount St. Mary's Seminary sits on a co-ed college campus. Mount St. Mary's University was Mount St. Mary's College back then. I suppose it's a university of about 2,000, maybe a little more, undergraduates. And I always thought that was a very healthy environment. I mean, we had our own buildings, our own classrooms and all that. But when it came time for food, we shared the dining hall with the college kids. We had our own dining hall if we wanted to go to it, but cordoned off from the kids. But most of us chose to go and just commune. We'd play basketball and tennis out on the courts with the college kids. I always thought that was now that's not possible for all seminaries. It's not possible at your seminary. But what are some things here in the remaining time we have? What are some things that a seminary can do to make sure that the seminary environment is not a complete monastic enclosure?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think they do the best, like when they have, their pastoral or apostolic assignments, whatever happens during their breaks and vacations. But, you're correct that these seminaries on campuses, like, St. John Vianney up at St. Thomas in Minnesota is right on the campus of the University of St. Thomas,
right,
just like yours was. And so there's a lot of mixing and fellowship with just normal college students. And the fact that they have separate houses, because I know when people argue against seminaries being on university campuses, they are concerned about the unique intensity might be lost regarding the mission of formation.
Okay.
But I think that can be really preserved with the separate residential system that we have. And, this is the way it happens sometimes in Rome, too, where you just have residential houses and they go off to university. So the formation is going to happen in the residential house itself. The fact that they're mixing with regular undergraduates, I think would have the added benefit of them, socializing, developing their personality that way. The obvious thing of, women are on campus and how are they relating with them? But we have to dispel the myth that somehow guys in a seminary aren't relating to women or thinking about women. I mean, to some extent, they think about them too much. And so they're normal guys. And so I'm not sure just placing them on a seminary campus is going to solve some problem of celibacy or chastity discernment. But it might help with just the fellowship and the the development of personality and the edges of personality that their peers may have to take off, these sharp edges that peers can take off.
We also had, I agree with all that, by the way. We also had lay people in our seminary classes. What do you think of that?
Yeah, this is something else that's promoted quite regularly since all the sex scandals. And it's sort of like a talisman a little bit. Like if we had women in classes, if we had other people in classes, then somehow this is going to take care of the sex crisis, the sex abuse crisis. I'm not sure that's true. I wouldn't be opposed to it, but I would have to reconfigure a little bit how I would present theology, because when I teach theology in a seminary, it's ordered obviously to the intrinsic meaning of theology, but it's also ordered to the celibate male pastoral ministry that this man is dedicating his entire life to. And there may be other lay students in the class who just want to study theology or dedicate themselves to lay ministry, but that's a different spin on how you're going to meditate and contemplate the theological truths in that particular group. So I wouldn't be opposed. I don't think there's anything intrinsically evil about it, but it certainly would take a different tact on how theology is presented.
I totally agree with that, Jim, that you just teach it differently if it's just the seminarians, because you're teaching them for a particular mission, and their questions will be different in front of lay people. They're not going to ask these really tough questions of you, not theological necessarily, but even that has to do with ministry. I think the seminarian would feel a little hindered if they were lay people and women in the classrooms. Not maybe some classes, not all, give them that experience, but I do think it's just a different experience.
Vocationally, theology is going to be the nourishment of their mind for their life.
Right.
What we tend to in academics, when it's not like a seminary situation, is that we're training professionals for a career. That's a very different way of exposing the revelation of the gospel.
That's my main problem with it. I mean, I had we didn't have tons of lay people in our classes at the Mount, but a smattering here and there. And I always resented a little, not that I would talk to them, some of them became my friends, but I thought it's the same thing. It's like, it's a little step down on the professionalization of what's supposed to be going on here. We're supposed to be learning what we need to learn in order to be priests. And yet it seems as if the professors are sometimes going out of their way to tailor what they're saying to the lay people that are in the room. And I thought, well, I'm not certain that's a good thing. But anyway, we're going to, do you have any last words? Because I know you got to go. We got to go.
Yeah. Let's get Michael Heintz back and have the rest of the conversation.
Let's do
maybe a couple other people from the seminary world, if you want to continue the conversation.
I would love,
we could have.
In particular, I would love to continue on with a more theological conversation about what theological voices should be. Like you said, you told me in an email, Msgr Heintz is a big Bouillet scholar and stuff, and we could have a talk about the kinds of theology. But anyway, let's have a future follow-up conversation.
Yeah. And next time, let's do it from the farm. I want to see those welly boots on Carrie.
Well, we can do it from the farm. It's just that the internet gets a bit sketchy when we get further and further from the house. But anyway, Hey, thank you so much, and we'll be in touch.
Good to see you. Bye-bye.
Sorry, my thing kept going off.